Good evening and welcome to our debate on language and power. We're so happy to have you. We tend to think that sharing experience is essential to being human. At an individual level, we share experience to get to know others and understand them. We share political experience to build community and solidarity. Yet from the taste of an apple to giving birth, we know we cannot fully describe experience to someone who's not already had it themselves. And many maintain that the experience of discrimination can only be understood by those who have experienced it. Is the idea that we can understand the experience of others the liberal fantasy of a white, male, privileged elite? Should authors limit their writing to experiences they have undergone or which fall within the realm of their culture? Or is this a recipe for division and conflict? Should we instead do all we can to share experience and seek a common language to understand each other and the world? We have three brilliant humans to help us think through these questions today. First, John McWhorter is an American linguist and associate professor of English and comparative literature at Columbia University. He has written books on both language and race, including the forthcoming 9 Nasty Words, English in the Gutter, and Losing the Race, Self-Sabotage in Black America. Kehinde Andrews is a British academic, author, and activist, and professor of Black Studies at Birmingham City University. His latest release, The New Age of Empire, How Racism and Colonialism Still Rule the World, came out in February of this year. And L.A. Paul is a professor of philosophy and cognitive science at Yale University. She's best known for her research on transformative experience, and her book of the same name argues that we can know very little about our subjective futures. So here we go with our brief introductory pitches, 3 minutes each. We'll start with Kehinde Andrews, and the question is, can we ever really understand the experiences of others? Kehinde, go for it.
Hi, good evening. I suppose it depends where you are, but hello anyway. And I think the key part of this is really I want to focus on the power aspect of this. Because language is interesting, but really this is the whole issue here is the power. And we're not having this conversation in a vacuum, right? Can you understand the experiences? I guess in some theoretical realm, potentially, but we have to understand that there isn't just this marketplace of ideas where everybody comes to this equally. We're in a place, an arena, the places that produce ideas and language and where people can speak, are deeply problematic, rooted in centuries of racism, and deeply imbalanced, right? So when we're even starting to have that conversation, it is a conversation. You have to really understand the long history of the real question here is who gets to speak, who gets to write. And that really is the nub of this debate, right? That for far too long, if you think about the West, if you like, Britain, America, etc., Black and brown creators have really been locked out from that process. So you haven't had as many Black and brown voices there in the first place, and not just locked out accidentally, locked out on purpose, right? This is one of the ways that racism works. So we're not there, right? I'll give you a concrete. Actually, and we like to think this has changed dramatically, but it really hasn't, right? So if you think about publishing industry today, if you think about who's the producers, and as somebody who now really does work a lot with mainstream producers, mainstream publishers, you'll be very surprised how white it is, right? So the voices who are making the decisions are still very narrow. Actually, the book I wrote before this book was called Back to Black, Retelling Black Radicalism for the 21st Century. And the feedback I got from a major publisher was, it's too black. Like literally, that was the feedback. It's too black. And it just shows you there's a kind of playing field, right, that isn't equal, right, that has particular norms and expectations. As well as there not being Black and brown authors, you've also seen that the way that Black and brown people have been represented has been historically terrible. These hackneyed stereotypes, flawed characters, going all the way back to Othello, right, coming through with ideas like the mammy and the matriarch, terrible movies like Gone with the Wind, etc. But again, look at today, it's not that much better. The idea of the black box, the hoodlum, the really narrow roles that Black women still operate in the mainstream media and television, etc., and in literature. So when we're having this question about can people represent, it's the wrong question. is, can we trust the institutions we're trusting to represent Black people and brown people effectively? And I think the answer is no, right? And we have to, again, it really is about saying we have a discourse, a public discourse, we have a way of producing ideas which is really distorted by historical delusions and myths, right? Which isn't an equal playing field, which doesn't always, which, you know, you can have great representation, but it's almost the when you do, it's almost kind of it stands out, right? Because it's out of the norm. And so the kind of final point I make is that it is this kind of liberal idea that we don't want division. We just want this. If you can get if the other people can understand you, this is what is the solution. This is complete nonsense. I mean, we've been on the right side of the argument for 500 years. This is not done us any good, right? Like, it isn't the case that we haven't tried to make these arguments. It's the fact that when you try to make these arguments, you find you end up talking around in circles, or oftentimes talking to yourself. And the honest truth is that division is rooted into the system that we have. And the idea that we just all need to come together and hold hands and share experiences is the solution is really not the case. Actually, a bit more conflict is probably what we need.
Thank you so much. John, how do you respond to this admittedly flawed question? Can we ever really understand the experiences of others? Please.
I understand what Kehinde is saying, but I find what he's saying to correspond more gracefully to a present tense analysis than thinking about how history proceeds. And history, unfortunately, proceeds slowly. That's the problem. Revolutions are rare and usually don't work. And so my brief answer to the question is that, for one thing, there are three things. One thing is that I worry that this is the question that we ask so very, very much when we talk about understanding. If somebody from 50 years ago listened to a question about us understanding each other, they would almost be perplexed that our spontaneous impulse today is to assume that the question really refers to that of oppression. And it's not that oppression isn't real, but we're to assume that the most interesting thing, the most urgent thing, the most important thing to address about human relations, especially in stratified societies, is who is oppressing who and whether or not the oppressor can understand the perspective of the oppressed. Now, it's not that that's a meaningless topic, and it's not that there isn't injustice in the world, but that is one of what I would venture is several dozen facets of what it is to be human, what it is to be a human society. And I think that the way we're encouraged to look at it ends up being a minimization, not of what it is to be, and let's face it, white. It's a minimization also of what it is to be brown or something else. Oppression is real. It is not the defining experience of all people who are not white, to the extent that especially we have been told in a mainstreamed way since roughly June of last year. Second, I am worried that we're saying that white people don't understand without thinking about how much less they understood as recently as 25 or 30 years ago. I see great progress on this. With all due respect, Kehinde, I don't go through life myself thinking of whites as, if I may, as obtuse as you're implying, that we just keep beating our heads against a wall. It feels to me as if teachers I knew when I was, say, 5 years old, we were going back 50 years at this point, really were quite clueless compared to roughly anybody who was allowed anywhere near a student today, for example. I think that slowly society is acquiring an understanding of how the person below feels that is unprecedented in the history of the species. 300,000 years of Homo sapiens, name any other time when the rulers are capable of even pretending to understand what they do to those down below, to the extent that today's intelligentsia, and frankly, even many not intelligentsia people do. I think that history is moving along. And very briefly, third, I think that when we have this particular sense of oppression, there's an unfortunate thing that happens because of social history where many people, not all, I wouldn't even say most, but there is an encouragement of those of us who are down below to exaggerate, I hate to say this, But to fabricate, to suppose that this kind of being misunderstood is the essence or the most important thing about being, for example, Black. And when somebody does that, they're not being deliberately manipulative. I'm not calling anybody a snowflake either. But this happens. It happens more than we like to think. I don't like mentioning it. But the way we talk about this encourages a lot of Black young people to think that the most interesting thing about them is their victimhood. And I find that diminishing, not of white people. I'm not defending white people here. I find it diminishing of people of color to focus on it in the way that we do. I think that we need to change the dialogue somewhat.
Thank you so much. And Laurie, over to you. The question, the invitation here is to respond to the question, can we ever really understand the experiences of others? Please.
Well, like a good philosopher, I'm going to say yes and no. So I'll start with no. And to see why I think the answer is no, I'll quote Aldous Huxley, where he says, "We live together, we act on and react to one another, but always and in all circumstances, we are by ourselves. We can pull information about experiences, but never the experiences themselves. From family to nation, every group is a society of island universes." Now, this is about the problem of other minds. So in a certain way, the answer is no. We can't ever really understand the experiences of others because we're all fundamentally alone in a disturbing way. But in another sense, I think there's hope. That comes when we have experiences that are similar to the experiences of others, right? And hopefully, with empathy and epistemic humility, we can attempt to try to understand something about the experiences of others. But I don't want to be too optimistic about this for just the reasons that have been sort of outlined by Kehinde and John already, because when people have had very different kinds of experiences, those of us who haven't had those kinds of experiences lack access into the distinctive nature of that lived experience. Without living that kind of experience ourselves, we should not pretend that we have the ability to understand the nature of that experience. Instead, we need to step back and listen and respect the fact that sometimes people have experiences and live their lives in contexts that are foreign to those of us who live our lives in a different kind of context. And so in order to fully understand their experience, we'd have to project ourselves into their lived experience and have that experience for ourselves. And that just may not be possible. So we need to recognize that. And I think one job of a white person like myself is to listen and to understand that there are things that maybe I can't know, and to respect that and to respect the testimony of somebody who's had a different kind of lived experience than I've had.
To continue watching this video, click the link in the top left or in the description below, or visit iai.tv for more debates and talks from the world's leading thinkers on today's biggest ideas.